A while back, I did a video on Friday the 13th fan films, and I have to admit that they were a lot of fun to watch. And it's nice to see different takes on the franchise from a homegrown perspective. So I thought that I would do that again with the Nightmare on Elm Street films and check out some fan films featuring Freddy. I have to tell you, I was a little more nervous about this one because Fred's a tough character to play and play well. So let's see how well some homegrown versions of him come off. Let's begin with one of the more noted ones on here and go back to 2015 for the confession of Fred Krueger. It starts by showing us a young boy that a text screen says was killed back in 1968 and details the arrest of Krueger in suspicion of the murder a few years later in 73. And they bring him in, revealing that classic ugly Christmas sweater. For some reason, he has soot all over his face and talks about not knowing his actual age, and he was raised by a Mr. Underwood, and he's worked at the power plant for the past 4 years. He details some stuff about his early life, and there's a quick glimpse of a matchbook for the rabbit in red, so it looks like this is tying in continuity with the Halloween films, or at least there's a version of that lounge in this universe as well, although they're in separate states, and this would be during the time period that a younger Michael was locked away. They throw in a bit of extra detail to the backstory by giving more information about what made young Freddy who he is, and one of them is that he was used for child prostitution, which is a touch darker than the films went. They also go a bit more into the creation of the glove, and they do a good job with getting into these things without having to retcon or contradict the films. Of course, since most of the film is a conversation between Fred and the police chief, a lot of the film hangs on the performance of Kevin Roach, and he does a decent job with it. It's nearly impossible to step into the shoes of Robert Englund, and the part of Krueger is especially hard to pull off, particularly at this stage of his being since he's still human and has to seem intimidating without the burns and powers and stuff. And he almost pulls it off. He comes off very actor-y most of the time, feeling someone playing evil as opposed to someone that's actually evil, but it's still a really nice performance. This one's pretty short at just around a half hour, was directed by Nathan Thomas Milliner, and he's mostly been involved in making fan films, and his most recent work was doing something Star Wars related, and this one's pretty enjoyable. It's short and sweet, and even though it's not really telling you a whole lot that you didn't already know, it's told really well, and it's worth a look. It looks like this next one is another prequel because we're looking at 2017's Before the Nightmares. We have Officer Thompson, and he's having a dream about little Nancy, and look at that! They're in the old LA Zoo, where lots of awesome stuff has been filmed, like Police Academy 2, The Eraser, and the last Amityville movie. I guess this is supposed to be the 70s, and we meet our human version of Freddy, and see his wife and little Catherine, and seriously, if you're gonna set your film in the 70s, you gotta try to make it look like the time frame a little bit. Oh, and this Freddy hates trees and has to punch this branch. He also makes his glove and uses it to kill a little kid. And it should probably be scary, but look at this. This is hilarious.
Open your mouth.
They show us him continuing his reign of terror and also him killing his wife, and his daughter was a lot younger than this. Wasn't she? She was younger than this. And how dumb is Freddy? He's killed like 20 kids, and then in broad daylight, he just strolls up to a kid while cops are literally 10 feet away and gets himself arrested. Like, first of all, have some awareness, guys. But I also love that they just straight up chase and tackle a guy for literally talking to a kid. And the cop has an iPhone, so I guess that we're just not setting this in the 70s? Like, this is in modern times now? And this one was both written and directed by Brendan Wynn, and it's his first fan film style short, but he made a couple of other original pieces, but none after this. It lists the budget at around $5,000, and it's only around a half hour long, so it's pretty quick. And out of the group of films that we're going to see that want to give us the pre-burn Freddy story, this is probably the least effective. Like, it's all the story beats that we know, and this is basically the same as watching the first episode of Freddy's Nightmares, but way cheaper. It's also the one so far that feels the most like it was just made by regular dudes with no actual film backgrounds. It comes across as a movie that was made by some guys in their backyards, although with a bigger budget. But it hits several moments of unintentional comedy, so I found it amusing, but probably not for the reasons they wanted me to. Let's really go into a world that you can only go into with fan films with 2021's Gotham Nightmare. We're in Gotham and, hey look, it's Bruce Wayne. With a thick Greek accent. And yes, this has Batman. And he stops a drug deal, but it seems like the guy was working for Freddy? It's a month later, and Bats is working on a case where women are dying in their sleep, and there's a Commissioner Gordon here, as well as a version of Hugo Strange. And yeah, just prepare to have everyone talk with a really strong accent.
Easy, Bruce. Don't get excited.
You can't stop him this way.
But you can.
How?
There's a Bane here, and I guess a Jason? Jason is in Arkham? There's also a Poison Ivy and a Two-Face, and Bats agrees to enter Arkham and quit being Batman in an effort to confront Freddy? I don't know, it's not all that clear, but Bruce signs up for therapy with Hugo Strange, although I'm not sure why he had to be committed to Arkham to do that instead of, just a therapist. This one's only 22 minutes long, so it's pretty damn quick, but Freddy doesn't even get involved until the last couple of minutes, and he's fairly silly looking. It's just a cheap store-bought mask and ill-fitting sweater. And his fight with Wayne is, well, not good, but it is funny. You could probably guess that this is Greek based on the names that show in the credits, and it's directed by George Stamatakis, and it's basically all he's done outside of a music video. There's no budget here, but I can't imagine it cost all that much. Most of the costumes look like they're from the store, and the ones that are created, like Two-Face, look kind of goofy. It's really sloppy, and also rather laughable for the wrong reasons, and it's also anticlimactic as can be. This next one will sound familiar because it's the beginning of a nightmare from 2015. It shows us a guy discovering a woman in a shower with Freddy's glove on her hand, but that's just a dream. He's a young guy named Michael, and he's house-sitting this creepy old place and asks a couple of friends to come over and hang out with him there. They say that it used to be an institution, and they were doing drug testing on their more psychotic patients, but Amanda Krueger asked for them to reduce the levels, but they snap, and that part of the story happens. Although the details were a lot different from what we've seen before because it's broad daylight, and there's doctors there instead of her accidentally getting locked in for the weekend. They detail Freddy's birth and his childhood, going through the same events that we've seen in the other films, and the creation of the glove, and becoming the Springwood slasher. As they spend the night, eventually some stuff starts to happen, and it becomes clear that Freddy is still there and starts the slashing. This is another one that keeps it short, since it's only running about 30 minutes long, and weirdly there's not much info on this one out there. There's no IMDb listing for it, and the film credits David N.O. as writing and directing, but there's no listing for anyone with that name online. If you search up the actors that are in the film, you can find entries for them, but this film is absent from their filmography. There's no budget or backstory or any other details, so it's a bit of a mystery. But it's approaching this one like it's more of a slasher film than it is a dream story. It's not hard to watch, but it's also not great. And again, isn't really giving us much that we haven't seen already. This next one says that it's from 2017, but it's actually technically from 2011, and it's Krueger Tales from Elm Street. It kicks off with a human version of the Fredster once again, and he has an encounter with Nancy's mom while she's still pregnant with her. He narrates the film and gloats about how no one in town will ever catch on to him and his killings, and discusses becoming the Springwood slasher. We see him in the trademark outfit, showing off the glove, although I'm not sure how he expected to keep his cover, just sort of running around after kids while wearing this thing out in broad daylight. I guess if you were surprised that the original series seemed to dance around showing him actually killing little children, as opposed to the teenagers he'd stalk after getting his powers, this one has you covered. We also see his daughter, little Catherine, and show several instances of him going after the local kids. Much like the previous films, we get a bit where he's arrested and has an interview with the police, although this one says 72 instead of 73, and then it's clear that this was shot at different time frames because Freddy's hairstyle, length, and color changed from segment to segment. as we get the sequences that lead up to the big burn moment. And this is also fairly short, running around 40 minutes, and was originally a web series. It was 5 episodes long, and this version of it is the supercut of all the episodes strung together to view in one sitting. The saga took them a few years to complete, with his first entry releasing in 2011, the next in 13, 2 more in 14, and the final entry in 2016, which is the explanation for all the different hairdos and also the lack of recurring characters. It was by Chris Notarile, and he's got a huge roster of fan shorts online, ranging from this to Darkman to The Tick to the Powerpuff Girls. They actually even came back to it after the series for a different take on it with New Tale, The Demon of Elm Street, that was more of a take on the new Nightmare and took place in the real world with the filmmakers as themselves. It's also pretty good, but again, doesn't give you a ton of info that you aren't already aware of. Plus, even though I think he's pretty good in the role, I'm not a huge fan of Roberto Lombardi as Freddy, since again, I think it's a case of perhaps trying a bit too hard and coming off as a cartoonish form of evil, which doesn't feel appropriate for this stage of the killer's life. He does show up in the final entry with the makeup and all, and he seems to fit better there, but it also shows the seams as it's more of an imitation of what Englund does instead of being its own thing. This next one is extremely recent and is a little shorter than the others, and it just came out a short while ago at the end of 2024. It has a young woman named Linnea working at a doctor's office, and the doc wants to talk to a Miss Shea, likely first name Lynn. She seems extremely nervous and is desperate to stay awake, and I'm sure we can all guess why. And oh, her name is Amy, so I guess no relation. Amy was born in '94, and she looks to be a teenager or so I guess this is set a little earlier than release, because I'd factor this to be around mid-2010s then? Turns out that Amy is pregnant, and she's there for a checkup and refuses a sedative and shows signs of violence on her legs. Eventually, though, she drifts off to sleep, and things pop off as the Fred appears and starts the slicing. The look is fairly accurate to the film, as is the lighting for that dream world feel, even if our slasher looks a bit slimmer than we're used to seeing him. He doesn't do much with dream trickery though, since the Krug likes to use the claws and does him some cutting as he preys on Amy, unless he needs that kid for something else. And this is quite a bit shorter since it's only 17 minutes long, and it moves fast and was by Bill Crossland. And unlike the other directors we've talked about, it's the first fan film that he's been involved with. His other films were more original works, and this shows a pretty good eye. It looks really pro-shot, and the Freddy is a good interpretation, and again, mainly sticks to what had been done before. It has a kill in it that's a little weird and sexual based that does seem a little out of place for Freddy. I guess it shouldn't, given the backstory of the character, but in the context of the version that they're giving you here, it stands out. It's quick and enjoyable, even if the ending feels a bit abrupt. This next one was also pretty recent, coming out in 2023, and it's The Last Dream of Detective Coleman. Looks like this is another one that's set in the past, since we get an intro telling us about the original killings and mistrial. They mention Detective Coleman, the lead detective in the case, who is the one who forged the documents that got Krueger off the hook, and it looks like his daughter was one of the victims. He follows Fred around, and the actor playing him is actually a decent look-alike for Englund. They confront each other, and I have to say, Paul Austin Bailey kind of nails it as Freddy here. Not really doing an impression of the original, but still coming off as actually dark and not just pretending to be. They get into a tussle, and Coleman is knocked out, triggering a wild series of dream images, and it's done in an interesting way because it's not in the style of the OG series and has a different surrealism to him that works well. Whereas those always felt like the real world in which Freddy could break the rules because it was only a dream, this feels more like how nightmares actually are, with nothing much making sense in random images. This one's around 40 minutes long as well, and is said to have been made on a budget of only $1,500, which is impressive because it looks like more, particularly with all the corpses and the bug creature. There's really only 2 actors in the whole thing, Paul Austin Bailey and also Philip W. Bailey, and I'm guessing they're brothers, and the pair also wrote the film together and Paul directed, and this one is pretty damn good. Like, sure, it's perhaps too simple and not giving us anything that we don't already know and haven't already had presented in those earlier fan films, but it's really well done and worth checking out. Here's another one from 2024, and this one is called Resurrection of a Nightmare, and it gives us the rundown right from the start and lets us know that this is set 20 years after Freddy vs. Jason, so it's in modern times. Looks like there's been a couple of decades of no Fred, and he's still trying to break on through. There's this woman, and she's a writer who's struggling, and she's hilarious. Every S sound she makes is really drawn out, and it's awesome.
Just give me a few more weeks. Yeah, I know, you've already made a damn payment, but I swear it will sell like my previous book. I know what the public wants.
Looking for inspiration, she hears about Freddy, and it looks like they're saying that Freddy has been talked about since then, and stories were told, but fictionalized. She writes a story in which a witch returns Freddy to life, and I suppose we're partially working off of new Nightmare rules here since it really works. He shows up in her dream in classic form, and they've got the look down, but then we're reintroduced to Neil Gordon, much older now. Freddy confronts him, and then there's this girl, and she's texting her friend, and she reads every text that she sends out loud, exactly like everyone does, because everyone says whatever they type in conversation out loud to themselves as they type it.
I find it exciting. Those noises.
She falls asleep, and it looks like someone found that whole AI filter thing for their film, and it turns out that she knows just who Freddy is, though, and talks about Jason beating him, and there's a recreation of that, just in someone's backyard instead of Crystal Lake. I guess she turns out to be the daughter of Freddy Krueger, so she's Freddy's granddaughter, and I have no clue what's happening here. It was about the writer, then about Neil, then about little Amanda, and then it's about this guy. It was written and directed by Chris Heaven, who has also made several other fan films in the past, and it looks like this was just meant to be the first episode of a series of fan films. It says that it was shot remotely, with each actor filming their own segments in their own home, pandemic style, which is why no one interacts with each other, and it's just a series of shorts. Heaven himself plays Freddy, and the makeup or mask they use is fine, but it seems like it restricts facial movements quite a bit, and he's essentially just doing an impression of the film version, and that's fine, but this is pretty silly. It's probably the most fan film filling entry on this list so far, and the least polished, but it's amusing. This next one is from 2016, and it's called Don't Fall Asleep, and begins with Nancy being dragged into an institution with her streaked hair. And there's a voiceover that's actually by Heather Langenkamp herself to give it that extra boost of credibility. Young Nancy is played by Deandra Laser, and what's interesting is that she's actually appeared in this role in several fan films now, including one from Chris Notarile. There's a nurse named Johnson, and she has a daughter named Alice, of course, and we hear Nancy trying to pull things together after the events of the first movie. It's clear that Freddy's still operating, though, and coming after her, but she determines that he's much weaker because of taking his power from him. Soon, the other patients there are starting to see Freddy in their dreams as well, but the doctor starts to think that they're hysterical and decides to prescribe sedatives. Somehow, even without the aid of Kristen, they wind up in each other's dreams, and the expected results occur. There's a little bit of lore here because they mention it as Nancy's dad's assistance in getting the deaths here covered up being what lost him his job and led to him becoming a security guard in part 3. But I like the aspect of his alcoholism after his wife's death causing that more. It then gives us the bridge between these events and where Nance ends up in the third film, and this is around 45 minutes as well, and it's said to have been made for around 10 grand. It was directed and co-written by Paige Troxell, who pegs herself as a lifelong Nightmare fan and shows it with this entry, as well as directing the documentary Fredheads, which discussed the massive influence of Freddy fandom. And it's decent. It's filling in the blanks a bit for Nancy, even if it's not having any big reveals, which is a downside of fan films because they can't really impact continuity all that much and have to work within the realm of the films without upending the apple cart. I think the most impressive thing here is that IMDb claims that the entire thing was shot over the course of only 2 days, and there's a ton of setups in this movie, which makes that a bit surprising. I think my biggest criticism on this one is Freddy himself, and even though he looks okay, they don't really light him that well, and he's right out in the open, which makes it clear that it's just a mask, and the actor is not great, just doing that imitation of the movie version again. This next one is from 2020, and it's called A Nightmare on Elm Street, Up All Night. It starts outside of Craven's Bar and Grill, because of course it does. There's some bikers called the Sons of Vengeance, and they have something familiar on their patches. A British man comes into the bar and meets up with a woman, and she talks about a boogeyman in a hat. She wants to stay up all night, and he suggests that he could take care of that for her, and they go home together, although she soon whistles a familiar tune, and her calendar starts to bleed. Oh, and I guess it's Friday the 13th, and she has suspicious claw marks on her arm. This one's pretty short since it's only 17 minutes long, and it was directed by Jeremy Brown, and he has a big fan film pedigree since he directed Friday the 13th Vengeance, one of the more well-known for that series. He actually did this one immediately after that one, and right before doing a non-fan film called Solitude. It was made for around £10,000. It was done in the UK, and I guess I won't spoil it except to say that at the end it becomes a bit of a mashup of horror icons with a pair of cameos. It does look really professionally done and is one of the most polished looking entries on this list in terms of lighting and set design, and it's fun enough. It's pretty lightweight since it's just a quick little tale of Freddy and seems to set up something bigger, more so than just being on its own thing, but it's worth a watch. This next one is odd because it's the first part of a series called Slasherverse, and it's from 2022. It starts with a young woman waking up from a dream, and it's said that someone or something is watching her, and she's attacked by a masked man. But that's all just a story that Emily is trying to write, but her friend tells her that she can come up with a better killer. Her therapist recommends she look into the local history, and she does and finds information about Freddy Krueger and the instances that occurred afterwards with people dying in their dreams. That night, while sleeping, a familiar glove appears, and Freddy's here, and it's a mask again, with a guy doing the movie version, including the puns. Seems that her writing about him brought him back, and she has to now survive. This one is also pretty short, at a mere 16 minutes, and it was an episode 1 of a web series that basically brought all the big-name slashers into the same universe. The first episode here had Freddy, episode 2 was Halloween-based, part 3 was Friday the 13th, episode 4 was Scream, and the 5th and final entry was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They had some recurring characters that would pop in through several of the episodes, and the last one would come back to the beginning with a quick Freddy cameo. The whole thing was by Conrad Farage, and he had a couple of other fan-oriented shorts, but quite a few original ones as well. And these are pretty fun. They're well put together, although I'm actually kind of bummed that, given how polished the rest of the episode is, how cheap that Freddy looks. This next one is a big one in terms of length, and it's Freddy's Return, A Nightmare Reborn from 2009. It looks like it has a pre-burn Freddy as an ice cream man who takes this little kid named Kevin, and I guess he survives, and his dad was one of the ones who torched him. He's still haunted by him, though, and many years later, he's a teenager. Things start happening as Fred's still attacking, and he goes about his life hanging out with his friends and reuniting with a girl that he used to know. That night, he has a dream about Freddy, and this one takes the interesting tactic of having him unburnt. Kevin's also visited by Amanda Krueger, who gives birth to a little guy, much like in The Dream Child. His friend Bandit then appears in his dream, and his arm turns into a Freddy claw and stabs him, but then bursts out of his body. Now, he's finally burnt-faced Freddy, and it's a nice makeup, and the actor is sort of doing the movie thing, but also throwing a little bit of his own into it. Unlike some of these other fan films that seem to mostly focus on Freddy slashing people with his glove, this has some dream stuff happening in it. Amanda appears and says that she had tried to contain him, but is unable, and it seems like this is set in between parts 5 and 6, and Kevin tells everyone that he thinks that Freddy is responsible. Since this is in continuity with the other films, they believe him kinda easily, and there's some nice filmmaking tricks like this shot with the spiders in the bed. It then plays out a lot like the Freddy films of the era, with the wisecracking style of Fred and the reality warping styles as he goes after the kids, but for some reason can't hurt Kevin, a fact that frustrates him. And when I say it plays like a movie, it's because this is the only one on here that's fully feature length. Longer, actually, since it's a little over 2 hours long, making it longer than any of the actual film entries. It was written and directed by Jason Korsiak and was actually the only thing that his name is attached to, and that's kind of a shame because there's some nice amateur filmmaking going on here. It's clear that there's love and understanding of the franchise, and they did a good job of emulating those films and their styles. The unfortunate bit is that it didn't emulate the pacing, because at 2 hours long it does drag quite a bit and can use a good half hour or so chopped out. But I thought that even if it lacked the style and polish that some of these that had a bigger budget behind them did, this one did the best with feeling like the source material. Here's one that made a lot of waves when it was released, and it's 2004's Freddy vs. Ghostbusters. It begins with our boy coming after a guy named Neil, and he narrowly avoids getting slashed. We meet a couple of characters, including Ed and Eugene, and Ed is the nephew of Egon, and has been taught how to use some of the ghost-busting equipment. They meet up with Neil and encounter some paranormal activity right away, so they suit up. They go up against a Slimer-type entity and then go into business in Denver, doing up a whole montage thing, just like in the original Ghostbusters film where they become the talk of the town. They eventually discuss those bad dreams that Neil had been having and find out that he hasn't had them since he stopped sleeping on his mattress, so they theorize that it might be haunted. And sure enough, when his roommate takes a nap on it, the Fredster shows up and do what he does. They figure out who and what he is quickly and get down to business by burning the mattress, which turns out to set him loose, and he goes on a rampage through Denver. So the Ghostbusters have to jump into action and stop him once and for all. Oh, and marvel how poorly aged the scene is where Freddy kills Jared the subway guy. And is this molester on molester violence here? And this is the earliest one on this roster, and it's a little over 30 minutes, directed by Hank Braxton, and this was his first project. After this, though, he continued to do a number of short films and even shifted into low-budget features like Jurassic Hunt and the 2023 Glowsies. This particular one got a ton of attention at the time and even had a full-length sequel called Return of the Ghostbusters that became so well known that there were references to the characters in the official Ghostbusters video game. The budget is listed at being around $500, which they make go pretty far, and I'm assuming they did that by having their own Ghostbuster gear already and not needing to buy any. It's a fun little flick, even though it does look rather amateurish, but it's worth a watch. The final film on this list is the one that got the most attention recently, and it's from 2023, and it's Dylan's New Nightmare. We're in Hollywood at an audition for a new Hatchet film, and Dylan Porter is up for a role. So, Dylan is played by Miko Hughes, who played the role of Dylan in New Nightmare, but this all turns out to be a dream. Freddy then reveals himself to Dylan, sporting a slightly different look, but the design is more reminiscent of the main series version as opposed to the New Nightmare styling. I should also point out that this kick-ass Freddy design was sculpted by our buddy Mikey Rotella, and it's a great look for him. Fun fact, back when the remake happened, a test makeup that Mikey did for fun and posted on his social media was reported as the actual look for the film, even though it was literally just done for fun and wasn't connected to the production at all. But he did do this one, and it looks amazing. Dylan is talking to a therapist, and it seems like he had a bit of a falling out with his mother, Heather Langenkamp, and is hesitant to talk about Freddy, likely as to not give him the power in belief. Turns out that Heather has been institutionalized, and that night, Krueger again appears before him. Looks like the claw is more patterned after that Part 7 version, and he does sport that trench coat look here, and the actor that does Freddy here is Dave McRae. And he's mainly a voice actor, and he's doing a really good job here because it feels like Freddy, but he's also doing a bit of his own thing, making the character a touch more distinct. He starts doing his biz, letting Dylan know it's him, setting up a face-off between the two. So, clearly, this is serving as a direct sequel to Wes Craven's New Nightmare, and only deals with the characters involved there. And even has a voice cameo from Nancy, although it's not actually Heather Langenkamp, and weirdly, it's voiced by Deandra Lazar, who played Nancy back in Don't Fall Asleep. It's by Cecil Laird, and was produced by Womp Stomp, the same company responsible for the Never Hike Alone films. The budget was $30,000, and it's just under a half hour long, and it does end in a cliffhanger since it's meant as the first in a series of shorts involving the characters, although there hasn't been any news about follow-ups since then. It looks really nice, although I admit that it's missing the meta punch of the film that it's a follow-up to. Like, sure, it's set in the real world, but all of the actors are playing characters as opposed to themselves, so it feels just like another film world, and Freddy feels more like movie Freddy than the entity that he was there. Also, I'm not sure why he's back, although it could be because there's no more Freddy films, but they never get into that, but perhaps will in later entries, if there are any. So there you have it, a whole bunch of Nightmare on Elm Street fan films. And these are all pretty enjoyable. You know, I have a good time with this. I have a hard time like slagging really hard the things that are made with love and just a lot of effort. Because clearly the people that made these movies can't really profit off of them. They're not allowed to legally. So they're just making these for their passion and love of the characters and this series. So I gotta give every single film on this list kudos for just getting it made. But yeah, there was some pretty good stuff here. Let me know if you've seen them or if you'd like to see them, or if you know of any other really cool Nightmare on Elm Street fan films that I should check out. Tell me that in the comments below. If you like this video and want to see more things like it, hit that like button to let me know you enjoy it. If you're enjoying what you see on the channel overall, subscribe to it and hit the bell so you get notified when new videos come out. And check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines and help support this channel. I appreciate you. I appreciate you for supporting me. I appreciate you for just watching these videos. And we'll see you very shortly for another great one. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.